I'm Jackie Kemp, and I'm presenting today's Full Scottish with two guests, Fiona Grahame, who's in Orkney, and Sandra White, who's in Glasgow. And we're going to discuss some of the issues of today, but first of all, I'm going to just give you an update on what's been happening in Ukraine. So it's day 340 of the conflict in Europe. Ahead of an EU-Ukraine summit next week, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that Ukraine has unconditional support from the bloc, and it needs to prevail against Russian attacks to defend European values. A Russian strike killed 3 people in a residential district of the eastern Ukrainian city of Kostiantynka on Saturday. 14 other people were wounded in the attack, which also damaged 4 apartment buildings and a hotel. Russia is claiming that the Ukrainian military deliberately struck a hospital in a Russian-held area of eastern Ukraine on Saturday. Russia said the strike killed 14 people and wounded 24 patients and medical staff. Kiev and its Western allies are engaged in fast-track talks on the possibility of equipping Ukraine with long-range missiles and military aircraft. Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky, said Ukraine said on Friday it would take pilots about half a year to train for combat on Western fighter jets such as the US F-16s, and as Kiev steps up its campaign to secure fourth-generation warplanes. Ukraine got a boost this week when Germany and the United States announced plans to provide heavy tanks to Kiev, which is now hoping that it can also get long-range missiles and fighter jets. On Saturday, North Korea denounced US pledges of battle tanks, claiming that Washington was crossing a red line to win hegemony in its proxy war. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryakov will hold a meeting with Lynn Tracy, the new US ambassador to Moscow, early next week, the Russian news agency reported. Volodymyr Zelensky has redoubled his efforts to stop Russian athletes performing at the 2024 Olympics, saying that would sort of justify the war against Ukraine if they're allowed to compete. Zelensky said on Friday that Ukraine would launch an international campaign to keep Russia out of the Summer Games, which will be held in Paris. Okay, so first of all, can we, Fiona, what is your what do you think about what's the situation in the Ukraine? I mean, obviously it's the tanks. Is that kind of going to be good news, do you think?
I don't think you can term anything good news when you're talking about war and conflict. However, what I will say is that this war will continue whilst Putin is still in power. I mean, that guy, he's not going to back down, and he doesn't care how many Ukrainians, how many actual Russians perish in this appalling war. He doesn't care about that. It's about power and prestige for him. So whilst he's still in power, that's going to continue.
Yes, yes, I understand your perspective. What about you, Sandra? What do you think?
Well, like Fiona, I think war is a terrible thing, and talking about tanks and etc. Being given to Ukraine to defend themselves. But where I really worry is way back the Crimea situation. The world knew about that. The West knew about it and did nothing, and that emboldened Putin. And this is just escalated from them. I mean, my heart goes out to the people in Ukraine, in fact, people who are suffering all over the world when there's war. I just am very disappointed in NATO and some of the other Western countries for the fact that they didn't go in earlier, and now we're at this particular stage where, as has been said by Fiona, Putin won't give in. He just won't give in. His ego is too big. So whilst, yes, you can say there's more tanks and various other pieces of weaponry. War is not a good thing for anybody, but my heart goes out to the people in Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a tough winter and a difficult situation. And I suppose everyone's kind of preparing for the idea that there's going to be a spring offensive of some kind. Yes, it is. It's a difficult story to discuss because it's obviously so much human suffering there. Um, what do you think about the Russia participating in the Olympics? Do you think that should or shouldn't happen, Sandra?
I don't, sorry to me, sorry, I don't think they should be allowed in that respect. When you think that there are Ukrainian athletes competing, and here you have Russian flags and Russian athletes. If anything at all, I'd prefer to see sanctions, which obviously have happened, but not as much as should have happened. I mean, we still have some oligarchs. We've got a lord, a Russian lord in Westminster. So a lot of it has just been lip service, I think, in regards to sanctions. But I think it's some way forward not to have the Russians competing in the Olympics at all.
Yes. What do you think on that one, Fiona, about the Olympics?
Well, they always say that politics shouldn't be in sport, but sport is incredibly political. And winning an Olympic gold medal and standing there and your national anthem is playing, well, you can't have a country that's invaded another and is so aggressive like Russia. You can't have that going on at a sporting event. So, no, but hopefully, let's hope there's more diplomatic moves before 2024 and we actually get a peaceful result, if that is at all possible, to this appalling war.
Yes, that would be great, wouldn't it? If we could, yeah, if we could somehow find some end to the conflict, that would be good. Okay, well, let's hope that we don't have to keep discussing this every day until the middle of 2024. Let's move on to a UK story now. You'll have seen that Nadeem Zahawi was finally sacked from his post as chair of the Conservative Party after a couple of weeks at least of this rumbling scandal over his the penalty that he was forced to pay on his taxes. What do you think about that, Fiona?
Well, firstly, I'm going to say that there's a lot of actually honest politicians, that don't do stuff like this. But what we had in 2016 with the advisory referendum to leave the European Union was a whole referendum a whole campaign, the Brexit campaign, based on lies. And it was all about tax avoidance. So no one should be surprised that this UK Tory government is actually filled with all sorts of tax dodgers and well, folk that push away at lies all the time. Because that's what that government is based upon. That's their foundation. And I'm sorry to say that last year, Mr. Zawad, he's no longer in government. He's been sacked. He came to Orkney, and there was a small protest about that visit. But what a disgrace for our islands that we had him here, and after we had Boris Johnson as well. I mean, where is the thinking with that? Because these Tory guys, they're appalling. Let's just call them out on that. And their whole Brexit disaster is all part and parcel of their tax dodging.
Right. So I've read that before that that was one impulse towards Brexit was the idea that the EU is a bloc that's maybe large enough to impose regulation on some of the kind of dark money that's sloshing about. I've just been reading Butler to the World by Oliver Bullock, which is kind of about Britain having become a sort of island that's a magnet for really dodgy money, oligarchs and so on, and a lot of the people who have fingers in those pies, they didn't want to be part of the EU because they wanted to they want to just have that ability to launder money. I mean, is that kind of what you're saying, Fiona?
Yeah, well, the EU was bringing in
Mm-hmm.
regulations on tax and tax avoidance and all the rest of it, and that's what basically Brexit was all about. But they managed to use racism and immigrants and migrants and asylum seekers, as an excuse. They went after them,
Yeah,
playing on everybody's, people's fears, particularly in England, playing on
yeah,
people's fears instead of what it was really about, and it was about tax dodging.
yes.
And we're not surprised that this UK government is filled with it.
Yes, and there's interestingly been a documentary about Narendra Modi on BBC, and I believe he's a good friend of Rishi Sunak's father-in-law. So again, there's a kind of there are some very dubious connections to that whole sort of wing of the Conservative Party which managed to take over the party. Would you agree with that, Sandra?
Well, I agree with everything Fiona has said. I mean, we have to remember, yet the EU was bringing in regulations, and that's what Brexit, as Fiona has already said, was all about. And we're all suffering now. But as someone who has just paid my tax bill and then got another letter in that I owed some more money and had to go back and pay some more, people like myself and many others are honest and they're paying the tax bill. And the only reason this guy has been sacked is because he's been found out. And it's the tip of the iceberg. I mean,
Yeah.
let's look at Sunak. Let's look at him. Let's look at his wife, non-dom. Only found out, then she declared and had to pay tax. Let's look at Johnson. They carry on with the PPE, giving contracts to friends. I won't mention Michelle Moten, well, I will have done now anyway. But I mean, these people should be in jail. They're criminals, absolute criminals. And they've brought, this country, Scotland obviously included, who didn't vote for Brexit, they've brought it to its knees. And ordinary people are doing their best. Well, these crooks, chancers, criminals, I'll call them, are still sitting there. Every one of them should be investigated because
It's
every
quite
one of them have got something to hide.
yes, and I was in and criminals and I'm just being pointed out alleged criminals, but
There's
but actually I went to an NUJ meeting recently about slaps because there's a kind of increasing use of these strategic lawsuits against public participation. That's kind of what that stands for. And in fact, one of the most scary things is that so how we try to use that process of law to prevent the tax lawyer who was investigating his affairs from even discussing the case. So Dan Needle wasn't allowed to even tell his friends what he was investigating because of the slap. And it is a very worrying sort of legal instrument that can be used to keep things hidden. And
well,
so that's concerning too.
this is a big problem. I mean, if we had a decent media, I know we're going to talk about the BBC later on. If we had a decent media, this would all have came out months ago. It wouldn't have got as far as this. But unfortunately, not just because of using, legalistic, items, etc. It's because, for some unknown reason, the media in general, present company excluded obviously, the media in general have not wanted to touch any of that. They've actually
Yeah.
just went past it. If it wasn't for individuals, independents, and Carol Vorderman and various others as well, who are flushing this out, we would never have
Yeah.
heard anything about it.
Well,
And
the
they'd still have
guard.
been sitting there. So a lot of people are responsible who should have been doing something about this.
That's
And yeah,
true.
you mentioned alleged criminals. But people like Lester Piggott went to jail for tax avoidance.
Yeah, I
So
know.
basically, this is tax avoidance and they're getting
Yeah.
away with it. I think
I
every
mean,
single
actually,
one of them should resign.
It's evasion. It's sort of, yeah, tax evasion. But actually, Michelle Mone, I have to just say that the Guardian did a really good job on kind of explaining what Michelle Mone had been sort of up to. And if it wasn't for the Guardian, we wouldn't know about that. I mean, arguably, should we really be having to rely on the media? I mean, surely these organisations ought to have some kind of way of ensuring that crooks don't that people don't behave like this in the first place. I mean, this is the Houses of Parliament. They didn't appear to have any safeguards in place to prevent Michelle Mone, exploiting the system to extract money from the public purse. Now, should we be relying on the media? What do you think, Fiona?
Well, I'm struck by the fact that there's people this week coming to visit, working families having to visit a food bank, and people that are elected, or in the case of Michelle, non-elected, but who are supposed to have higher standards than all of us, when it comes to ethics, are actually some of the worst possible persons to be in positions like that. And so I think we, in a wider issue, we have to look at the type of people that are being elected, that are being put in places where they can abuse their power. And of course, the House of Lords, that just shouldn't be there anymore in a modern, supposedly democracy that we have anyway. But just think of the people that are worrying about putting food on the plate and heating their homes, rather than the guys actually employing people so that they can get around paying their taxes.
Well, that it is. It's a real contrast. But as to the point as, how should we? I mean, it seems like Westminster hasn't really been able to to kind of regulate itself in any meaningful way. I mean, arguably the House of Lords is a lot worse since the Labour Party got hold of it, because they made it a kind of creature of patronage. I mean, arguably the hereditary peers were, at least they were more independent of government. Now it's donors and cronies, and as you say, people like Lord Evgeny Lebedev of Siberia. Why is he in our legislature? It seems extraordinary.
Could I come in and just
Yeah,
just in a
Sandra.
small piece on that, and thank you. I mean, the Westminster is not democratic, and it's all coming out in the wash now. It's never been democratic, and the reason we are getting people like Michelle Mone and others being elected or not being elected, being put forward to the House of Lords, is because of the patronage, yes, but even the people that are supposed to investigate them in Westminster are cronies of the people they're investigating. And you can go into the BBC, that particular issue as well. And the rot has started way back, obviously from Brexit. And it was aided and abetted by the media. Not all of the media, as mentioned, The Guardian, but I think they've got a lot to answer to as well. Now, good investigative journalists, as you've mentioned already, yeah, I think we have to rely on them. If we didn't have the small handful of them, we'd never know half of what's going on in Westminster. I mean, the whole place really needs to be abolished. It is not
Yes.
democratic at all.
I think we'll move straight on to the BBC. I'm going to bring that up the schedule. Actually, investigative journalism costs money, so okay. I'm being told that I'm not allowed to do that. Okay, okay. So we'll break off from that to talk a bit about the issue of police misconduct. Yeah. So we're going to return to this general subject further down the agenda, because obviously it's the kind of some of the issues that you raise about cronyism and so forth are very, they're very live within all of those institutions. And I think people have seen that the historic rules that by which the British establishment was governed, which is called the good chaps theory of government, Gavin Astor wrote about that in his book How Britain Ends, which is an excellent book that I'd recommend to anybody. And he just sort of talks about that, Britain doesn't really have a written constitution, and the kind of assumption is that people are educated in a way that means that they accept certain conventions about how they should behave. And then if you end up with people who've taken over the system who don't accept those conventions, there are really no safeguards. And I think we've seen in the USA that it has a much more robust set of institutions with, a lot more people courageously trying to prevent abuse than we've. Sadly, Britain's been pretty craven in most ways. They haven't been able to protect British democracy, I don't think. But that brings us on to the kind of police, because again, then you have a system where, and this is the case in lots of countries too, that people are given this role of policing society, and if they abuse that role, it can be terrifying for citizens, and we've seen quite a lot of this recently in Britain, and also we're very aware of what's been happening in America, like the Tara Nichols case, Sarah Everard, Shaku Boya. There's a number of cases that are live at the moment in Scotland and England of female police officers who've tried to complain about their colleagues and they haven't been taken seriously, sexual assault and rape and so on. So yeah, big problem. What's your response to that, Fiona?
Well, there's actually a bill coming to the Scottish Parliament this year, based on the report produced by Eilish Angelini, to reform the police complaints procedure and various other things about policing bill. The general public are actually very supportive of the police. I mean, the last household survey was something like 87% of people supported the police, particularly in their local areas. But serious misconduct allegations are not always being dealt with the way they should. There's a lot of sexual misconduct allegations as well. Often these are within the service itself. So the policing service itself has an issue with sexism and racism within its ranks. Now, one of the things being proposed in the bill going to the Scottish Parliament is a code of ethics. And that would be certainly worthwhile having. Politicians should be having that as well, given our previous discussion. But also that serious misconduct allegations should be public processes. And I think that's very important to maintain public confidence in our police service, because it is a position of power and responsibility, but they police through consent. And if they lose that consent and support of the public, and then they can't do their jobs properly. So that's why this new policing bill is really important.
Yes, and I think that is will they have body cams? Do you know if they're going to include that in the bill? Will police have to wear those?
Well, they already have body cams, so I mean,
Right.
they do have all that paraphernalia anyway.
Okay, and I suppose if you're going to have that level of transparency, then you have to be aware that things are going to come out that look pretty nasty, and I suppose if you have a situation in which police who misbehave are dealt with, then you have to in fact see that as increasing confidence rather than decreasing it, because at the one hand we'll be more aware of when things go wrong, but then that we need that transparency to deal with it. Do you agree with that, Sandra?
I think we do need the transparency. You just need to look at the Sheep Bayou, situation. It shouldn't take years for a family to ask for an inquiry into what happened. And there certainly is misogyny and racism within the police force. Not every policeman, but yes, it is there. Where is it endemic? Perhaps the inquiry will bring that out, and the new legislation that's going through the Scottish Parliament, perhaps that will flush that out if it's endemic or not. I mean, there are decent policemen out there and policewomen, obviously, but there is I think it's to do with control. You know, they'll enter the police force. I mean, is there enough checks and balances before they get the job in the police force? That's something I think that should be really looked at. We talk about an ethics, code of ethics. I would have thought that would just come naturally, but obviously it isn't. And how do you, pardon the pun, how do you police this code of ethics? I think there's lots of questions will be asked while it's going through the process of Parliament. But, the transparency, once again, it really has came from the lawyers and the families who have suffered this. You look at the situation, obviously down in England, we say that Everett, and, it was known. It was known within the Met that these people had a WhatsApp group, these policemen had a WhatsApp group. They're misogynist, and yet it was never. They were never pulled in. It was never stopped. It was only when that came out, and that was good investigations to that as well. So we definitely need transparency because people rely on the police. They want
it's
to trust them.
interesting. Interesting to think
them.
they want to trust them. Yes. Interesting to think
the
where do people get their ethics from?
Eroded.
We need
trust is being eroded.
Trust is being
Fiona
eroded.
mentioned
Yes.
about the local police. Well, certainly we hardly ever see any local police in our area, and I'm not the only one. Perhaps it's different where you are, Fiona, but people like to see the police walking the beat, etc. You hardly ever see that now, and that was a trust. That was a trust thing. I think we've got to get back to basics on that, and perhaps ask the public what is it you want from your police force.
One of the things that I've really been aware of since they introduced Police Scotland is that the police just put their sirens on all of the time in Edinburgh, and they didn't used to do that. When we had separate Edinburgh and Glasgow police, the Edinburgh police were, in my view, they were just much less likely to use their sirens all the time. And I actually did a bit of investigation, and they don't log it, or there's nobody kind of asks them why and when they put their sirens on. It's not really monitored. It's kind of up to them. So if somebody's stolen a bottle of whiskey from Lidl or whatever, and they want to go over there quickly, they can put their sirens on, even though arguably it's a little bit disruptive to the kind of soundscape of the city. Permanent sirens. I'm aware of hearing them all the time now, and I don't like it. I sort of object to it as a kind of unnecessary auditory kind of reminder that these people can constantly, are just driving around, and that they're able to do that as they wish. But I can understand as well that from the police's point of view, they may feel that other people don't really understand what they go through or the risks that they feel that they take on a daily basis. And you obviously want people to join the police force who are, have a high tolerance of risk, or who are able to deal with situations that many people might prefer to avoid. So I guess you are looking for a particular kind of person. And then we also have to consider perhaps, where do people get their ethics from now? People live in bubbles. They spend a lot of time on the internet. They could be reading all kinds of weird stuff. People don't go to church, which I think creates a bit of a vacuum in the sense of that kind of shared space where people might discuss ethical questions. What do you think, Fiona? Where should people get their ethics? How should we ensure police have the right ethics?
Well, your ethics come from a wide range of places. If you're talking about personal, like a person's own ethical standards, they come from a wide range of places, including family, if they have a religion, whatever faith they may have, where they live, community, a whole range of things affect personal ethics. But what we're talking about is a code of ethics for the police. So that's slightly different. It will obviously be influenced by a person's ethics, but a code of ethics for the police service is different than what you're maybe referring to as a personal thing. I'm going to say that most police officers, they have a really difficult job, and they have to deal with some appalling crimes and situations, which fortunately most of us never ever have to experience. But there is an issue within the service of racism and sexism. There is an issue about how these issues are dealt with, and that serious allegations should involve a public investigation. So that's your transparency there. And I think there's been a wide consultation about the police bill going through Parliament. And if you look on social media, you'll notice that the police service itself have a lot of consultations that people can take part in. What would you like to see local policing in your area like? They've got recruitment campaigns for more diversity within the service. So all those things are happening. And I think the bill going through Parliament is a way forward for a modern future policing service.
Okay, so that's what we want, a modern, progressive police service that looks more like the society that it has to kind of work with. Yeah, Sandra, is that what you would like to see?
Well, basically, yeah, but who they represent. It should be a model of people here who are in Scotland, and it should be representative of that model. I mean, I think
Yeah,
it would be good, and it'd be good if the media. I keep talking about the media right now, picked up on what is happening as it goes through Parliament, because
yeah,
whilst we have, we can see stuff online. There's lots of people, particularly people who are more affected by policing in certain areas,
yeah,
who don't have access to this. So they won't know about consultations. So perhaps it's more about the police going
yeah,
out into these areas and have public meetings and speaking to the people on the ground, because these are the
yes,
people who are going to be affected. I would say, for me, that's more transparency in that
yeah.
respect.
I think more responsibility. I was just sort of thinking that actually with Scotland's very low birth rate and very aging population, if we have a police force that looks like the population, you might pick up the phone and get a bunch of 70-year-olds to come to your house, which might not be kind of exactly what you expected, but we do have general issues with not having enough young people to fill these roles, which is a struggle, I think. How do you think Scotland compares internationally in terms of managing these issues, Sandra?
Well, basically, I mean, in other lots of European countries, you have two separate police forces. You'll have your community police, and then you'll have the police who deal with more serious crimes. And I know we do have, obviously, we've got detectives, etc., etc. But the police who do the community policing, they don't have the same powers. But they're the people that the public, general public see. So I think perhaps looking at what's happening in Europe, certainly not what's happening in America. You don't want to take anything from there with the police there, but looking at other operations in different countries. Yeah, I don't see any harm in that. I don't know what's going through the police bill. I haven't looked at it as I've retired now, trying to stay away from these things, legislation, etc. But I think there's no harm in looking at how other police forces work in different countries. We can
Yeah.
all learn from others.
That's interesting about the community. Maybe we could have more sort of 70-year-old community police officers. What do you think, Fiona, about the international comparison?
I was just thinking about the always raising our retirement age, and I'm one of those waspy women, and they're wanting to make
Yes.
police officers and firefighters and everything work even longer, and those are jobs you can't have. Older people, I'm trying not to be ageist here, obviously, but you have to be really fit to do those jobs, like physically and mentally, but physically fit to be a servant police officer, a firefighter, a paramedic, any of those jobs.
Yeah.
So, but we can, obviously you can look at what other countries do, and I'm sure they do. But I would look at ones that are comparable in size to Scotland, like maybe New Zealand or some of the Scandi countries, and ones where the population isn't all centred in huge cities, because there is a problem with policing rural areas, because obviously it's a bigger geographical area to cover.
Yeah.
Um, and so you need to put all those factors into consideration with any
Yeah.
police service. But no, we don't want like older sorry,
But you might
older
have to.
people in
You
a
might,
job
yeah.
like that.
But the average age on the Western Isles is something like, it's going to be 50 soon. That's the average age. So if you take out everybody under 18, you're going to have older police officers. And I mean, perhaps you can have two kinds, as Sandra suggested. Like, I don't see why you can't have community police officers who are doing, some of the job, like going to schools and talking to them about litter or whatever, community police officers might do. I don't see why you can't have people in their 70s doing some aspects of the job. I mean, clearly you want a mix of people, but we are going to have to confront the fact that we have one of the oldest populations in the world.
I don't think you solve that by putting people who are physically unfit to do such a job as policing. I mean, into that job, and our police officers do go into our schools and talk to them about a whole range of things. And I think it's important for children that they see that the police officer that maybe haul somebody up for drink driving is the same one that comes into their school and talks to them. So it's not seen as some kind of bogeyman or anything like that. It's somebody doing an important community job.
Yeah. I think we will have to all try and stay fitter, though. People won't, you can't be like, oh, I'm 55. So, I think it needs to, people are going to have to consider that. There are few levers that we can pull when we have such a low birth rate and we don't have any control over immigration. There's no easy solution to the fact that we just don't have young people. We really don't have them. So
I don't think you can. I'm a WASPy woman as well, and I was on the cross-party group for the WASPy women, and I thank them all for the work that they did. And I mean, it's a choice, isn't it? I mean, I retired last year. I don't want to go back to work. I've worked since I've been 15. I don't want to go back to work. I don't think you can force people in. Perhaps we should be looking at why there's a low birth rate. I'm sure there's plenty of younger people out there. They don't all need to go to university. Maybe they're looking for something else there. And basically, hope and aspiration is something that we don't talk about a lot. But if you've got hope and aspirations, and I think this is something to do with the fact that we're not independent, but we're getting there, that would encourage, I'm not saying it would encourage everybody to have kids, but it would give them more confidence. Perhaps we should be looking at that to encourage more younger people into jobs like policing or whatever it may be.
yes, and we have all these asylum seekers as well that are, not being allowed to work. Yeah. So as Scotland gets more levers in terms of dealing with the population, there may be ways that we can deal with that. But anyway, it's an interesting subject, and I think we've covered that a little bit, and also society changes, doesn't it? Some of the ethics that were once, some of the ways people thought about lots of areas are sort of in flux. Sexuality being one of them. What's acceptable, what's unacceptable. How we should deal with or how we should treat transgender people. All of those issues are our ethics are changing, and so I guess we do have to be aware of the fact that some of the ways that people have thought in the past are no longer, they're no longer regarded as socially acceptable. So we're kind of muddling our way towards a kind of an understanding of what of what's important. I mean, I'm not saying that sexual assault or sexual misconduct was ever acceptable. It never was, but I think there was a sort of acceptance of sexism, which now, the WhatsApp group where police share sexist jokes. In the past that might not have seemed as unacceptable it is now. Would you agree with that, Sandra?
Sort of me. Yeah, I think things have changed. I mean, years ago, I always hated the word domestic violence. As far as I'm concerned, it's assault, it's violence,
Mm.
and it's not domestic. Years ago, it was, we'll go back to the police as we're talking about then, it was written down as a domestic. It wasn't taken seriously. So obviously that has changed, and that is good. So society moves on, absolutely. But as it moves on positively, sometimes it throws up some negativity as well. I think, being able to have a conversation about these things is the way forward. And what to me isn't acceptable is violence against women, against
Yeah.
anyone really, but in women in particular, we're being pushed and pushed and pushed more into the minority, whereas we got all these, we won all this equal pay, etc., etc. That for me is a worry as well, that we're going backwards on that particular part of it, and I think a
Yeah.
conversation is needed on that.
Yeah, in Spain, I think they call it I went to some kind of domestic violence thing, and they called it like violence of machismo, which seemed like a much better description.
Yeah,
Yeah.
should be.
So Fiona, do you want to wrap that up, that particular discussion, before we move on to the Brexit, or is there anything else you want to say about that?
No, I think we've covered that pretty well. I just think that, sexism it has no place in any workplace. So, police, anything, any workplace, it's not acceptable. It never was, but we're now more aware of it because people are coming forward and speaking about it more, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is good. That's good. So now we're returning to Brexit and the third anniversary of Britain and Scotland being forced to leave the EU is coming up. I've got my national today, so I've got my poster to put in the window. If you can't come on the Torchlit March, there's one in Edinburgh, and I think there's one in Dundee. I'm not sure if there's one in Glasgow on Tuesday. But yeah, I bought my torches, so I'm all looking forward to that. And I think it's becoming apparent just how much of a mistake Brexit was. What do you think? Do you think sort of people are becoming a bit more aware of what really happened in the Brexit thing, Fiona?
Well, people in Scotland were actually pretty aware all the way through that whole referendum, and that's why we had over 60, what was it, 62% vote to remain in the EU. People in Scotland had engaged with the debate. There was proper debate in Scotland and unlike elsewhere. Um, and after the vote, I mean, people in Orkney, where we benefited greatly from being members of the EU through infrastructure and academic links and all sorts of, EU workers coming to the islands, all sorts of things. Um, People were quite astonished that, that the Leave vote had actually won. Um, because, they were thinking about their own islands and people round here were very much in favour of Remain. It's been absolutely a total disaster for farming and for fishing, um, and of course for social care because a lot of our care workers came from the EU. And I noticed that this week the university statistics that were out, the numbers coming to Scottish universities from EU nations have plummeted. And that's a real tragedy, because that's young people and a whole, learning community not coming to Scotland and to our world class universities. So it's been a disaster on every single level.
Yes, and the horizon that on the university front as well, we're out of horizon, which is Scotland did really well in terms of really punched above its weight in terms of winning grants and the peripherality that the EU recognised when it gave out grants of people being right at the edge of Europe. The UK government doesn't recognise that. What do you think, Sandra? What are your kind of main concerns about the Brexit issue?
I could have a whole programme on Brexit itself. Maybe we should have that. Maybe we will. Obviously in a couple of days with the torchlight procession. It has been an absolute disaster. Scotland didn't vote to come out of the EU. We're now seeing lots and lots of laws, being torn up. I spoke earlier about, equality and women's rights, etc., all getting torn up because of this Brexit, which was basically based, as we mentioned earlier on in the programme, it was basically based on the Tory party, tax avoidance, and the way it was pushed forward, racism, absolute racism against immigration. It was ugly, absolutely ugly, and how anyone could have supported that is beyond the realms as far as I'm concerned. But and the moan about queuing up at passport control, I just look at it and I say, well, you're getting a wee stamp on your passport, but you've got to queue an hour or 2 hours just to get through this to get a wee stamp on your passport. It's absolutely ridiculous. We've lost so much. I mean, I was on the health committee in the Scottish Parliament, and the situation with trying to get insulin and various other medicines into the country because of all the laws, because we don't produce the insulin. And then obviously the price of things have risen. And all they talk about is, okay, they talk about Russia and Ukraine, but it's Brexit that's causing all of this as well.
Really, I
Brexit's the
know.
cause of the fact that the
Yeah,
prices have risen so much. And apart from obviously the utilities, etc., going up, electricity and all that stuff, people, are suffering every day. You used to
yeah,
get a pint of milk for 90 pence. Now you're paying £1.40, £1.50 for a
no,
pint of milk. It's an absolute disgrace. And I know the likes of the
yeah,
farmers, they're having it hard as well. But everyone is suffering
I
through
know.
the absolute situation of the Tory party. And I just wish there would be a general strike. I mean, I know we're talking about during this march, etc., but we really should be looking at a general strike, because it can't continue that people are dying of hypothermia because they can't heat their houses, or somebody can heat their stables, and we know who that somebody is. Ordinary
Yeah.
people, I don't understand the apathy. Brexit has brought all of this to a head, and really we should be calling a general strike and get rid of them, because they're going to suffer, all these laws
Yeah.
are going to get torn up by the Tories.
I mean, the trouble
EU
is there
laws
were
which
people on
affect
the left,
workers.
like Mike Lynch was a big Brexit supporter because they supported Brexit because they were like, they seem to have got a bit confused about, their priorities, or they didn't understand perhaps that they were, they just saw the EU as a kind of capitalist club, but they didn't actually see it as being a bloc where workers' rights and food could be protected, food regulations and so on could be protected, and we suffered all that propaganda against the common agricultural policy. But it's amazing if you go to Europe and you go to a European supermarket and there's loads and loads of fruit and veg that's beautiful. It's not wrapped in plastic. It's affordable, and then you go into a British supermarket and there's less. There's lots and lots of empty shelves. Our farmers are growing less. Scottish farmers are particularly hit because they can't get the seasonal workers to come over, and so they can't grow the amount of fresh fruit and so on that they used to grow. It's really it's extraordinary. And then you sort of wonder, do the British people who voted for Brexit, do they realise what they lost? the way that they used to be able to go and retire to Spain, and now they can't do that. Is that, do they know that? Do they notice that they can't do things like that? You wonder if they know how
I
idiotic they
mean,
were.
can I come back in again?
Yeah,
Is that all right? I mean, what gets me is that they listen to, obviously the stuff that was coming from the right wing newspapers, Farage and all of the rest, and they were allowed to spout their nonsense as much as possible. But what they ended up doing was blaming Europe, blaming the EU for anything that they couldn't, go and
yeah,
live in Spain anymore. They were blaming Europe because they listen to this, the media
yeah,
furore over it. And you're absolutely correct about the vegetables. I was lucky enough to get away for a week abroad in Gran Canaria, and I was amazed at the beautiful selection of food, and half the price we're
yeah. I
paying
know.
here. It was unbelievable.
It's half the price. I know. It's just really extraordinary, and the way. But I mean, arguably, you could argue for the EU. It's better that Britain's out of it. The way that the British MPs were behaving in the Parliament, like turning their back on the European anthem, and you know just sitting with people that denied the Holocaust. The Conservative Party were in a group with people that were denying. They were just absolutely out there, right on the far populist right, and an embarrassment. Um, but yeah, Fiona, what do you think about Scotland's prospects of getting back into the EU?
Well, do you know what really annoys me is that our citizenship was removed from us, and we're supposed to be in this family of nations. Oh, we would respect each part of the UK, and yet Scotland and Northern Ireland, because that's an enormous issue, Northern Ireland both voted to remain. But needless to say, our EU citizenship has been removed from us. And in Orkney, we're also having a torchlight or a vigil, whatever you like to call it, on Tuesday at 5:30 outside St Magnus Cathedral. And St Magnus Cathedral was built by the Norse Earls. Orkney's links with Europe go way back, way beyond our links with Scotland. And it's really quite appalling that we're not incensed as we should be that both our European citizenship was removed with a stroke of a Tory UK pen, and our farming and fishing decimated by the result of that. And the COVID pandemic has been able to mask a lot of the effects of what's really happened with Brexit. And now they're using the excuse of the war, the Russian war in Ukraine. But the economy plummeting in the
Mm,
UK, the mismanagement of it, is all down to that decision to
yeah,
leave the EU
I know.
against the wishes
Yeah,
of the people of Scotland and against the wishes of the people in Northern Ireland.
that's true. I was in Orkney in the summer, and there was only one place to eat open in Stromness, and it's like that all over the Highlands because they just don't have the those the workers. The people used to come over from Paris and Warsaw ever in the summer, and work in the hotels and then go back again in the winter. That was so important for the Highlands. So yeah, the Highlands and Islands have been hit worse than anywhere else in the UK. I'd argue because they've just lost so much. They've lost the funding, the peripherality money, the workers. It's awful. It's really awful, and we should be more angry about it than we are. And
Absolutely.
I feel that Northern Ireland as well is it's been put Ireland has been put in a very difficult position, really by a careless UK government. Okay, so now we're kind of moving on to the BBC, and that is one scandal that hasn't really had as much coverage as you might think, which is Richard Sharp, who was implicated in a deal to procure a £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson, and is while he was interviewing for the role of BBC chair. What do you think about this scandal, Fiona?
Well, the clue is in the name British Broadcasting Corporation, and people have a lot of nostalgia about the BBC because they remember Doctor Who and Strictly Come Dancing and Dixon and Doc's Green Street or whatever it was. So there's a lot of nostalgia attached to our links to the BBC, but broadcasting has changed considerably. I mean, Broadcasting Scotland is an example of that. And I remember back in 2014, the scaremongering about the independence referendum was that we'd lose the BBC, we'd lose Doctor Who, we'd be able to watch any of those programs. Well, an awful lot of people don't watch those programs anyway because they watch Netflix or something. They watch streamed TV. So broadcasting has changed considerably, and I don't pay for a license anyway. I don't watch the BBC. And if you want to change something, stop funding it through buying a license. Just stop watching it.
Right. Do you pay a license? Do you pay your license, Fiona, or not?
Oh no, I don't have a BBC license. I don't watch the BBC.
Okay, and do they come and hassle you about that?
Oh, I get letters all the time, and the dog shreds them. She doesn't like those.
Okay. What do you think, Sandra? Do you pay a BBC license?
No, I don't pay a BBC license. No, I don't watch the BBC.
Right.
No.
So
I think Scotland is the one who, what is it, is it the Daily Mail or the Sun and Telegraph? I mean, you can hardly pick a paper that tells you anything decent now. Scotland has the highest number of licensed dodgers, I think they call us. It's just the fact that we've chosen not to watch it, and it's simple as that. You've got
yeah,
Netflix, you can watch stuff on YouTube, etc., and it has changed immensely. But to get back to the situation of Sharp and Boris Johnson, I mean, it's endemic in this government, basically, that, their cronies are getting jobs. That is the biggest problem. And maybe it might change now that somebody has been obviously demoted, that's all. I mean, he's still an MP. Maybe they'll see this and think, oh, I need to protect myself. I don't know. But the
yeah.
problem here is that everybody that's in a position of power, and the BBC has a lot of power. I mean, you control the media. I don't need to tell you who said that. You control the media, you control people's thinking. And this is what's been happening, unfortunately, with the BBC. I mean, some of
And
the programmes are excellent, don't get me wrong. A lot of people enjoy them, and that's fair enough. But the propaganda that's been coming from it, particularly with the Scottish independence movement, has been
yeah.
absolutely awful. And to
Do you
have
feel it's a
somebody,
very unionist? Is that why your main objection
yes,
is that you feel it's a very unionist organisation?
absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. If it was independent and told you what was happening, in an independent way, well, that would be fine. But it doesn't at all. I mean, you've got,
Right.
basically question time. But I mean, for goodness sake, look who's on the panels in question time. It's a disgrace.
Yeah.
Basically, you've got unionist parties and people outnumbering folk, who are independently minded. And to have somebody like Sharp, who used to be a
Yeah.
government advisor, and to have other people who were, members of the
Okay.
Tory party, it's just a
Yes.
disgrace and giving it money.
It's
Yes.
yeah. And Fiona, is that your position too? You feel that it's too unionist? It's a pro-unionist organisation.
Well, Well, it's no error in any way that broadcasting was a power retained by the UK Parliament. And so Scotland doesn't have powers over broadcasting. I mean, we're very limited in what we can do in Scotland. And broadcasting is an enormously powerful tool. And although I've slagged off the BBC, there's still an awful lot of people, especially older people, that continue to watch it and get their news through it. So when it's through a prism of unionism and Tory propaganda, that's what they're seeing all the time, and then they'll buy the Daily
Yeah.
Mail or something in the local supermarket. always there on the newsstands, very prominent. So they're getting this continual feed. But younger people, anyone under the age of like 45 or something, is not still clinging to that old ways of media, and they're not getting their news via the Daily Mail. They're not watching the BBC. They're using Netflix or other streaming services. So it's a big issue
It
for
is.
the next independence campaign.
A lot of the things that the media that they use is very, very thin in terms of news coverage. I mean, I think the BBC's big mistake, personally, is that they're far too led by the newspapers. And on the newsstands in Scotland, there's such a hostile, pro-union, anti-independence kind of consensus that every news bulletin in the BBC, they just start with what's in the newspapers, and they should stop that, because in Scotland it just leads them down a blind alley, I think. So I think we're going to wind up there. We're just on 1 o'clock. So that's been fascinating. Thank you both for contributing to the programme. And what you said. So, and would you like to just say? Oh, okay. And I just need to say that I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to watch, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider doing so and becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of getting 10,000 subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. So goodbye. Thank you very much for watching.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
What do you mean? Okay, cheers.